Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Well, after a 4-year campaign, and yeah, it's been that long, the campaign has been going on since Election Day 2016, the 2020 election is finally over. So who won? Well, Donald Trump thinks he won, Joe Biden thinks he won, and the media has made their victory predictions, but they're just that, predictions. Nobody really knows who will be inaugurated on January 20th because the vote counts in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Nevada are not final. Actually, they're not final in any state, but those are the battleground states that matter. The soft deadline for certifying the vote count isn't until December 8th. And the hard deadline isn't until December 14th. That's the day the electors cast their votes in the Electoral College. So there's plenty of time to finalize the results. There are allegations of irregularities or fraud that are compelling enough to call their existing counts into question in the courts. And that is exactly what is happening. Tuesday night, although it was technically about 2:30 Wednesday morning, President Trump made a quick speech from the White House where he claimed victory in a few critical states, which, if true, would have given him enough Electoral College votes to win. And then he doubled down on that in subsequent statements. He's trying to win the battle of public opinion. Public opinion is irrelevant, Mr. President. The battle needs to be won at the canvassing office and in the courts. It doesn't matter what the public thinks, not legally. The problem with President Trump's claim is that the dwindling of his percentage of the vote was expected. In fact, I even put up a blog post on Election Day predicting that is exactly what would happen. And the reason is that nationwide, 100 million people voted early or by mail. That is 75% of the 134 million votes cast 4 years ago, and it's 63% of the 160 million votes cast this year. But 35 states and the District of Columbia don't even start to count their mailed-in ballots until Election Day. There's only 15 states, Arizona, Colorado, Delaware, Florida, Hawaii, Kansas, Maryland, Montana, Nebraska, New Jersey, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, and Vermont, that counted mailed-in ballots before Election Day as they arrived. Now understand that in those states, no human knows the count. Only the tabulation machine knows the count. But it means the results are known quickly. In Florida, for instance, state law requires the mail-in tally to be released within 30 minutes of the polls closing. And that's why we knew Florida's results so early on election night. But mail-in ballots have historically weighed heavily in favor of Democrats. And this year, you can add to that the fact that Democrats fear the coronavirus more than Republicans fear it, meaning they're more likely to vote by mail for that reason. Plus, President Trump poo-pooed the idea of vote by mail, which probably discouraged a lot of his supporters from doing that. And so that set up a scenario where Donald Trump's percentage of the vote would drop as states released every updated post-Election Day report. And that's exactly what we saw happen in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. Now, Arizona saw a Trump gain, but remember, Arizona counted mail-in ballots before Election Day like Florida did. And that's why Trump's numbers went up in Arizona as results were released. So the president's wrong on that. But that doesn't mean he's wrong on everything. He's also made allegations that fraud was being committed. And that may very well be true. There's certainly evidence that would indicate it. Now, that doesn't mean the evidence proves it, but it certainly means that it's suspicious and it needs to be investigated. So what kind of fraud is being alleged? Well, people are claiming that Wisconsin had more votes than registered voters, but that is not accurate. Wisconsin has same-day voter registration. So people are using the pre-election day count of registered voters and comparing it to the vote count. But because Wisconsin has same-day voter registration, tens of thousands of people registered to vote and voted on Election Day. Should there be same-day voter registration? Absolutely not, but the law allows it, so it is what it is. There's a rumor that in Michigan, Biden's vote count jumped by 138,000 votes without a single increase in Trump's vote count. Election officials say that was the result of correcting an earlier data entry error. And that explanation, frankly, seems reasonable. There was another anomaly in Michigan. In 2016, Donald Trump won 62% of the vote in Antrim County. But this year, he only got 41%, and that's an impossible swing. So Republicans cried foul, and election officials recounted. And what to their wondering eyes did appear? Trump actually won with 56.5% of the vote. Now, I'm not saying there was anything nefarious about that, but it's things like that that call the legitimacy of the count into question. But also in Michigan, there's a lawsuit alleging that spoiled ballots were being duplicated without Republican observers present. And that would be very illegal if true. But is it true? I don't know. Some voters in Arizona have sued because they were given Sharpies to complete their ballot instead of being given ballpoint pens. And their Sharpie marks bled through to the back of the ballot. But the issue is whether or not that bleed through would cause the tabulators to not read their ballots. And election officials say it didn't. But the lawsuit claims that the tabulator rejected some of the ballots and that those voters were denied a replacement ballot. Time will tell what actually happened. And even if it did happen, it may not have happened to enough people to change the outcome. We'll see. Nevada had problems with poll watchers not being allowed to observe. Also, Nevada had universal mail-in balloting this year. And although it was implemented through the constitutional legislative process, it still resulted in thousands of ballots being sent to dead people, all of whom were obviously ineligible. But the problem in Nevada is not just that there were ballots cast by dead people, ballots cast by people who no longer lived in Nevada, and people whose ballots were submitted after the lawful deadline, which also happened in Pennsylvania and Georgia, by the way. Those ineligible votes obviously should be thrown out. But how do you throw them out? Unless those ballots were tabulated separately and set aside separately, they're mixed in with every other vote, so there's no way to go back and remove them. The ballot pool, if you will, has been contaminated, and there's no way to decontaminate it. You can't just assume that every fraudulent vote was for Biden and remove that many from Biden's count. Although I do think it's probably accurate that the majority were for Biden because overwhelmingly, when voter fraud is committed, it is committed by Democrats. The critical state of Pennsylvania, with its 20 electoral college votes, had numerous problems. Supposedly, some elections officials notified Democrat operatives of mailed-in ballots that did not follow the procedures, such as signatures or whatever, and they gave them a list of whose ballots those were, which gave the Democrats an opportunity to go back and allow those voters to correct their ballots. Now, you might be thinking, well, that seems perfectly reasonable, and I would agree with you that people ought to be given an opportunity to correct their ballots. The problem is that Pennsylvania law doesn't allow it. Not to mention that Republican operatives were not given that information. Plus, it happened in some counties and didn't happen in others, which brings the constitutional question of equal protection and due process into the equation. If you recall, in Bush v. Gore in 2000, the Supreme Court said the process needed to be universal across the entire state. Also, in some counties in Pennsylvania, poll watchers were not allowed to observe the vote count. And even after a court ordered election officials to allow access, they didn't fully comply. And that made it very difficult to observe what was actually happening. Now, why wouldn't they allow the counting process to be observed? I can't think of a single legitimate reason. Now, I was an official appointed observer in the Florida recount 2 years ago. But we were observers. We were not auditors. meaning we watched the canvassing board do what they were doing. We could ask questions if we noticed an anomaly, or if it was a subjective vote, for example, being cast outside the bubble in the case of the manual tabulation. We could question that, ask to examine the ballot, etc. But it's not like they were asking us at every ballot, hey, do you agree that this ballot is a vote for so-and-so? It doesn't work that way. But it's worse than that in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania requires mailed-in ballots to arrive by the time the polls close. But the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, in direct contravention of the law, ordered that late ballots, even those without any postmark showing proof that they were put into the postal system before polls closed, had to be accepted. And the U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene in that, which I think was a mistake because the federal government absolutely does have a role to play in that. And I'm not advocating for an overarching, all-powerful federal government. The federal government should only do what the Constitution allows it to do. But the Constitution's Article 4, Section 4 says that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. That's a lowercase r in Republican. And a lowercase r, Republican form of government, is a form of government that manifests itself in an elected legislative body, not by tyrants on the court. Now, the governor of Pennsylvania is a Democrat, but the legislature is majority Republican. And the governor asked the legislature to pass a law that would have extended the deadline for receiving absentee ballots, but the legislature chose not to. Something that is completely within their rights. It is not the role of the court to decide that the legislature made a bad decision. Their role is only to determine if their actions or inactions were constitutional or not. And in this instance, the Pennsylvania legislature's actions were 100% constitutional. Now, I think it was foolish, but it was 100% constitutional. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court erred in making up their own law. And the U.S. Supreme Court erred when they chose not to correct it. Is all that impropriety in Pennsylvania enough to invalidate the entire vote count? Could the courts, and ultimately, I suppose, the U.S. Supreme Court, throw out the entire presidential vote in Pennsylvania? Well, if they did, it wouldn't result in a redo. What would happen is the Pennsylvania legislature would choose who the state's 20 electors are. And the Pennsylvania legislature is Republican. Now, that's not crazy or far-fetched. If you remember, back in 2000 with Bush v. Gore, the Florida legislature, which was also Republican, was prepared to throw out the people's vote and choose Florida's electors themselves. The reason they didn't do it is not because they lacked the constitutional authority. They had that. The reason they didn't do it is because Bush was ahead when the Supreme Court stopped the recount. So the people's vote sent Bush delegates to the Electoral College and the legislature didn't have to. But if the entire vote was thrown out due to massive and deliberate violations of Pennsylvania's very clear election laws, the Pennsylvania legislature could choose to give the state's 20 Electoral College votes to Donald Trump. What would happen if that occurred? And by that I mean, what would happen other than the Democrats going completely apoplectic with rage and riots burning down the state, not to mention cities across America? Well, Congress could refuse to accept Pennsylvania's 20 Electoral College votes on January 6th. That's the day they're tabulated in a joint session of the new Congress. And they actually could refuse to accept them even if they do use the people's vote count. But for that to occur, the House and Senate would both have to vote to reject them, and that is extremely unlikely. It's not impossible. I mean, this is 2020. Impossible things have been happening all year. Now, if they were rejected, that would probably mean that nobody reached the 270 Electoral College votes necessary to win, and that would put the decision in the hands of Congress. The House would choose the president, the Senate would choose the vice president, and that would probably result in a Trump-Pence victory, because in the case of the House, not every representative gets a vote. Each state gets one vote. And in the current Congress, Republicans hold majorities in the delegations of 26 states. Of course, it's the new Congress that votes that, but Republicans didn't lose any seats. So they might actually have majority delegations in more than 26 states in the new Congress. So if it was decided by the House, Trump would be reelected. Would Pence be reelected by the Senate? Well, that's a really good question because it doesn't look like anybody's going to be in the Senate from Georgia when this happens. And there could potentially be a tie. Of course, if there is a tie, Mike Pence gets to break it. Wouldn't that be funny? If Mike Pence cast the deciding vote to reelect himself? Oh, can 2020 get any crazier? The presidential election is obviously the big story, but there's also things a little closer to home that are worth talking about. We'll discuss what happened in Florida when the Mike Bates Show continues.